Marcus Johnson had always been a young man of strong character. He grew up in a small town where life was slow, and everyone seemed to know everyone else. From childhood, he carried himself with dignity. His mother, Angela, often reminded him that respect was something you gave and something you earned. His father had passed away when Marcus was only 10, leaving him as the man of the house. Even as a boy, he learned to be responsible, to work after school, and to make sure his mother never felt alone. When Marcus turned 18, he made the decision to join the U.S. Army. Many in the community were surprised. Some people encouraged him, proud that one of their own was brave enough to serve the country. But there were also whispers. Some doubted his choice, others said he would never last. Marcus ignored the doubts. He trained hard, endured the struggles of boot camp, and came out stronger, both physically and mentally. Over the years, he served with honor, earning respect from his fellow soldiers and superiors. Now, after years of service overseas, Marcus returned home for a short leave. He carried himself like a man who had faced storms but was not broken by them. He wore his uniform with pride, not for attention, but because it reminded him of the oath he had taken, to defend freedom and protect the weak. His mother's eyes filled with tears the day he walked back through the front door. She hugged him tightly, whispering, "You've made your father proud." For the first few days, Marcus enjoyed the simple joys of being home. He helped his mother with small repairs around the house, visited old friends, and took quiet walks in the park where he once played as a boy. But life in that town had not changed as much as he had hoped. Racism still lived in the shadows, sometimes loud, sometimes quiet, but always there. One evening, Marcus stopped at a local diner for coffee. He sat at a corner booth enjoying the warm aroma and the comfort of being back home. But soon a group of men at another table began whispering. Their eyes followed him, not with curiosity, but with contempt. Marcus had grown used to such looks during his life. He kept calm, sipping his coffee, reminding himself that silence often spoke louder than arguments. The following morning, Marcus's life took a sudden and cruel turn. As he walked out of the grocery store carrying a bag of bread and milk for his mother, 2 local policemen approached him. Their expressions were stern, and without asking much, they accused him of theft from the store. Marcus was stunned. He held out his receipt showing proof that he had paid, but the officers ignored it. Instead, they twisted his arm behind his back and placed him in handcuffs. People on the street stared, some whispering, some shaking their heads. Marcus's mother, who had come to meet him, cried out in disbelief. "He's done nothing wrong," but her voice was drowned in the sound of the police car's door slamming shut. Marcus was taken to the county jail, where the atmosphere was cold and harsh. He sat in the cell, replaying the event in his mind, wondering how such an injustice could happen so easily. He had fought in faraway lands for justice, but now, in his own hometown, he was treated like a criminal without reason. The news spread quickly. Friends of Marcus came to visit his mother, offering support, but the fear in their eyes showed they knew what was happening. The case was to be taken before Judge Richard Harlow, a man whose reputation was well known. Judge Harlow had served for decades in the town, but behind his robe he carried a history of prejudice. Many in the community whispered about his harsh sentences against black men, his cruel remarks in court, and the way he seemed to bend the law to his own will. Yet no one had ever dared to challenge him directly. On the morning of the hearing, Marcus stood tall as he was escorted into the courtroom. His uniform was still on, though wrinkled from the night in jail. He refused to bow his head. He refused to look broken. His mother sat in the back row, tears running down her face but pride still glowing in her eyes. She knew her son was innocent, but she also knew the judge before them was not a fair man. The courtroom was crowded. Some people came out of curiosity, others to see the drama unfold. The judge entered, his eyes scanning the room with authority. When they landed on Marcus, they narrowed slightly, as if he had already decided the outcome. The trial began with little patience from Judge Harlow. Marcus tried to explain himself, holding out the same receipt he had shown to the officers. But the judge waved it away as irrelevant. Witnesses who had seen Marcus pay at the grocery store tried to speak, but the judge dismissed them quickly. Every word Marcus spoke was interrupted, twisted, or silenced. It was as if the courtroom was not a place for justice but a stage for the judge's authority. Marcus clenched his fists at his side, but he kept his voice steady. His years in the military had taught him discipline. He remembered the long nights under fire, the pressure of making decisions when lives depended on him. Compared to that, standing before a crooked judge was just another battle, one he had to fight with calmness and dignity. Still, the weight of injustice pressed down on him. He could feel the eyes of the townspeople on his back. Some were sympathetic, but others looked at him with the same contempt as the men in the diner. His mother prayed silently, her hands trembling as she clutched the edge of her seat. The judge leaned forward, his voice dripping with disdain. "Men like you think a uniform will protect you, but in my court it means nothing." His words sliced through the room, leaving a chilling silence behind. Marcus lifted his chin. He wanted to speak, but he knew his words would only be used against him. He stood silent, his eyes steady on the judge, refusing to show fear. Inside, however, his heart was heavy. He thought of his fellow soldiers, of the sacrifices they had made together. Was this what their service amounted to, being mocked and falsely accused back home? The judge shuffled his papers, preparing to move toward a sentence even though the trial had barely begun. The gavel rested on his desk, a symbol of power ready to strike. And yet, even in that moment of despair, Marcus held on to hope. He remembered something his commanding officer once told him during a difficult mission overseas. The darkest hour comes just before the dawn. Marcus did not know what the dawn would look like here, but he believed it would come. As the courtroom sat in tense silence, his fate hanging on the lips of a prejudiced man, Marcus stood tall, not as a defeated prisoner, but as a soldier who refused to surrender his dignity. The morning sun barely reached through the tall windows of the courthouse when Marcus was brought back for the second day of the hearing. He wore the same uniform, its creases now more visible, its proud shine dulled by the dampness of the holding cell, yet he still walked tall. His back was straight, his shoulders squared, and his face calm. He was determined not to let anyone see defeat in his eyes. The courtroom was filled once again. Some townspeople came out of curiosity, others out of loyalty to Marcus, and still others because they wanted to see him punished. His mother sat in the same seat as before, her hands trembling as she gripped a small Bible. Her lips moved silently in prayer. A few of Marcus's old schoolmates nodded at him from the benches, their eyes filled with quiet encouragement. Judge Harlow entered with his usual air of superiority. He adjusted his black robe, straightened the papers on his desk, and scanned the room with a sharp gaze. When his eyes landed on Marcus, a faint smirk tugged at his lips. It was the look of a man who believed he had complete control, a man who thought no one would dare question his authority. The hearing began with the prosecutor presenting his case. The argument was thin, built on weak claims and the testimony of the two officers who had arrested Marcus. They repeated their story with confidence, though anyone listening carefully could hear the cracks in their words. They insisted Marcus had left the grocery store without paying, yet when asked to explain why he had a receipt in his pocket, they stumbled over their answers. Marcus's attorney, a local public defender who had been assigned at the last minute, tried to object. "Your Honor, the receipt is clear evidence of payment. My client should not be on trial at all." But Judge Harlow waved his hand dismissively. "That receipt could have been planted. It proves nothing." The audience shifted uneasily in their seats. A few whispered to each other, shocked at how quickly the judge dismissed something so obvious. Marcus remained calm, but inside frustration burned. He had faced enemies abroad, men who pointed weapons at him, but this felt worse. This was an enemy in his own home, a man with power hiding behind the law to break it. One witness, an elderly woman who had been in the grocery store at the same time, stood up nervously to testify. She clutched her purse tightly and cleared her throat. "I saw the young man pay. I was right behind him in line. He handed the cashier money. I even remember because I had to wait for change after him." For a moment, the room brightened. Marcus's mother's eyes widened with hope. Finally, someone was brave enough to speak the truth. But Judge Harlow leaned forward, his voice dripping with doubt. "Ma'am, are you certain?" "Memory can play tricks, especially at your age." Gasps echoed through the room. The woman's face flushed with embarrassment, and she sat back down, shaking her head in silence. Marcus clenched his fists under the table, but forced himself to stay calm. He knew if he reacted with anger, the judge would use it against him. The prosecutor smirked, sensing the judge's support. He pressed forward with questions meant to confuse rather than to seek truth. Marcus answered with dignity, his words steady, but each time he spoke, Judge Harlow interrupted, twisted his sentences, or spoke over him. At one point, Marcus tried to remind the court of his military service. "I've served overseas. I've fought for this country. I would never dishonor my uniform or my community by stealing." The judge's eyes narrowed. "Do not bring your service into this court. Wearing a uniform does not put you above the law. In fact, it makes your crime more shameful. A soldier should know better." Those words hit Marcus hard. His heart pounded, but he kept his face calm. To hear his sacrifice dismissed so easily, to be mocked for the very service he was proud of, was like a knife cutting into his soul. He thought of his friends in the military, men and women of every color who had stood shoulder to shoulder with him in battle. They never judged him by his skin, only by his courage. Yet here he was, standing in front of a judge who reduced his years of sacrifice to nothing with a single cruel sentence. The hours dragged on, and it became clearer to everyone in the room that the judge was not seeking justice. He interrupted Marcus's lawyer at every turn, sustained objections before they were even finished, and allowed the prosecutor to speak endlessly without interruption. The air in the courtroom grew heavy, filled with frustration and disbelief. Marcus's mother whispered under her breath, "Lord, send help. Don't let them destroy my boy." By the afternoon, Judge Harlow leaned back in his chair, his expression smug. "It seems clear to me," he began slowly, letting each word echo across the courtroom, "that this young man believes he is above the law. But in my courtroom, the law is clear. I see no reason to prolong this matter any further." The tension in the room tightened like a rope. The judge lifted his gavel slightly, preparing to announce a harsh sentence. Marcus stood taller, refusing to bow his head. His eyes were steady, his voice calm but firm. "I have done nothing wrong, and even if you silence me, the truth will stand." For a brief moment, silence filled the courtroom. Even the prosecutor seemed caught off guard by Marcus's strength. His mother pressed her hands against her heart, tears streaming down her face. But Judge Harlow slammed his hand on the desk. "Enough, you will not lecture this court. Your arrogance only confirms your guilt." The crowd stirred. Whispers spread. Some shook their heads in disbelief, while others nodded quietly, agreeing with the judge's cruelty. Marcus closed his eyes for a moment, remembering his commanding officer's words from long ago. "A soldier must stay calm in the storm. When the wind is against you, stand your ground." He opened his eyes again, ready to face whatever came next. The judge raised his gavel higher. "This court finds..." But before he could finish, the large wooden doors at the back of the courtroom creaked open. The sound echoed sharply, drawing everyone's attention. Heavy boots clicked against the polished floor as a figure stepped inside. It was a tall man dressed in full military uniform. His chest was decorated with rows of medals, his presence commanding respect. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Even Judge Harlow paused mid-sentence, his eyes narrowing with surprise. The man did not hurry. He walked with steady steps, his gaze locked on Marcus, and as he reached the front of the courtroom, he stopped, his voice strong and clear. "I am General Robert Anderson," he declared, "and this man you are trying to condemn is one of my soldiers." The entire room froze. Marcus's mother gasped, covering her mouth with her hands. Marcus himself blinked in shock, his heart racing. The townspeople whispered loudly, some standing up to see better. Even the prosecutor stepped back, unsure of what to do. The judge gripped his gavel tightly, his smirk fading. He tried to regain his composure, but the power in the room had shifted. For the first time, Judge Harlow did not look so sure of himself, and Marcus, standing straighter than ever, felt something he had not felt since the trial began: hope. The room fell into a stunned silence after General Robert Anderson introduced himself. His voice was firm, but it carried no anger, only authority, the kind of authority that came from years of leading soldiers and facing real battles. His tall figure stood proudly in front of the courtroom, his uniform neat, the medals on his chest gleaming under the dim lights. He looked like a man who had fought for truth his whole life and wasn't afraid to fight again. Judge Harlow shifted in his seat, clearly unsettled. For a man who was used to controlling every corner of his courtroom, this sudden interruption was like a storm crashing through a calm sea. He cleared his throat and tried to regain command. "This is a court of law," he said sharply, his voice louder than before. not a parade ground. You will state your business and leave. But General Anderson did not move. Instead, he set a leather folder on the table in front of him. My business, he said evenly, is to stand for my soldier. This man, Marcus Johnson, has served under my command. He has put his life on the line for this country. And I will not stand by while you strip him of his dignity with false charges. The crowd buzzed with whispers. Some leaned forward, eager to see what would unfold. Others exchanged glances, shocked that someone dared to challenge the judge so directly. Marcus's mother's tears now came not only from fear but from relief. She clasped her hands together, whispering, "Thank you, Lord. Thank you." Marcus himself stood motionless, his chest tightening with a strange mix of pride and disbelief. He had always respected his general, but to see him here in this small-town courtroom defending him against such injustice, it felt unreal. The judge, however, refused to back down easily. His face hardened, his jaw clenched. "General or not, this is my court. Your presence is out of order." General Anderson leaned forward slightly, his voice cutting through the judge's words like steel. "Out of order?" he repeated. "What is truly out of order is this mockery of justice. I've read the report. I have spoken to witnesses. I have in this folder evidence that proves Sergeant Marcus Johnson is innocent." He tapped the folder with his finger. "And I will not leave until this man is treated with the respect he deserves." A murmur of approval spread through part of the audience. For too long, they had watched Judge Harlow wield his power unfairly. Seeing someone with even greater authority stand up against him was like a fresh wind sweeping through the room. The prosecutor tried to interject, his voice uncertain. "Your Honor, perhaps we should review what the general has brought." But Judge Harlow slammed his gavel down, his voice rising in anger. "Enough! I will not be lectured in my own court, least of all by some—" He stopped himself before finishing the insult, but the meaning hung in the air. General Anderson did not flinch. He opened the folder and pulled out several sheets of paper. "These are official military records," he said clearly. "They show that Marcus Johnson was on active duty the very day this alleged theft occurred. He was serving overseas. This timeline alone destroys the accusation. The receipt he held was not forged, it was real, and the officers who claimed otherwise have lied under oath." Gasps filled the courtroom. The elderly woman who had tried to testify earlier nodded vigorously, whispering to those around her, "I told you, I saw him pay." Marcus felt his breath catch in his throat. The general had gone further than defending him with words. He had brought undeniable proof. Still, the judge's face grew darker. "This is irrelevant," Judge Harlow snapped. "This court will not be swayed by outside influence. Military records or not, this case is a disgrace," General Anderson interrupted, his voice steady but powerful. "I have led men into combat. I have seen them give their lives for the ideals carved into our Constitution. And here you sit, ready to condemn one of them without truth, without fairness, without even listening to witnesses. You insult not only Sergeant Johnson, but every man and woman who has ever worn this uniform." The room erupted in whispers again. Some clapped quietly, earning sharp glances from the judge. Marcus's mother held her face in her hands, overwhelmed with gratitude. Marcus looked at the general, his heart swelling with respect. He had always known Anderson as a strong leader, but now he saw him as something greater, a man willing to step into fire even when he didn't have to. Judge Harlow pounded his gavel again, his voice trembling with rage. "Order! I will have order in my court. General, if you continue, I will hold you in contempt." General Anderson straightened his shoulders, his presence even more commanding. "Do that and you'll be holding the United States Army in contempt. And I promise you, Judge, that will be a battle you cannot win." The silence that followed was heavy. For the first time, the judge's authority seemed fragile. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his hand trembling slightly as it gripped the gavel. Marcus watched the exchange closely. He could see the cracks forming in the judge's confidence. It was as if the general's words had peeled away the mask Harlow had worn for years. This was no longer just a trial. It was a test of power, truth against corruption. The prosecutor lowered his head, shuffling his papers nervously. Even he seemed unsure of how to proceed. The two officers who had accused Marcus avoided eye contact, their faces pale. The general took a step closer to Marcus and placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "Stand proud, soldier. You've done nothing wrong, and today the truth will stand with you." Marcus swallowed hard, emotions rising in his chest. For the first time since his arrest, he felt hope burn brighter than fear. The judge, desperate to regain control, leaned forward. "This court does not answer to the military. I will not be intimidated by medals and titles. The law is mine to interpret." But General Anderson shook his head. "No, the law belongs to the people, not to your prejudice. And if you continue this charade, I will take this matter beyond this courtroom. Every newspaper, every state official, every military leader will hear of how you tried to destroy an innocent soldier's life." The audience gasped again, louder this time. Some people stood to their feet, nodding, murmuring in support. The tide was turning, and even Judge Harlow could feel it. Marcus's mother wept openly now, whispering, "Justice! Justice at last." Marcus stood taller, his heart steady. The storm had raged around him for days, but now he felt the first rays of dawn breaking through. The judge stared at the general, his face red with anger and embarrassment. For years he had ruled his courtroom with unquestioned authority, but today that grip was slipping. His voice, once booming, now sounded weaker. This hearing will continue tomorrow," he muttered, but General Anderson shook his head firmly. "No, Judge, it will not. Today, justice will be served." And with those words, the entire room knew the battle was far from over, but Marcus was no longer standing alone. The air in the courtroom grew heavy after General Anderson's last words. It felt like every person inside was holding their breath. The townspeople leaned forward, sensing that something greater than a small-town trial was taking place. It was no longer just Marcus Johnson against a false charge. It had become a battle between justice and corruption. Judge Harlow's face tightened. He was not used to anyone defying him, especially not in his own courtroom. For decades, his word had been law. Men and women had walked into that courtroom and walked out broken because of his rulings. But now, in front of a crowd, his authority was being challenged by a man whose metal spoke louder than his gavel. The judge tried to sound strong, though a hint of weakness cracked through his tone. "General Anderson, you are overstepping. This case is under my authority. You have no right to interfere." The general did not raise his voice. Instead, he spoke with calm certainty, the kind of tone that demanded attention without shouting. "When authority is abused, it becomes my duty to interfere. Sergeant Marcus Johnson fought for this nation. He carried his brothers through fire. He shed blood for the same flag that hangs in this very courtroom. And yet here he stands, treated as if his sacrifice means nothing. If you think I will sit quietly and watch you destroy him, you are mistaken." The crowd stirred, whispers growing louder. A few people nodded, their courage awakening. For years they had seen the judge's cruelty, but had been too afraid to speak. Now, with the general standing boldly before them, they felt hope spark inside their hearts. The prosecutor shuffled uneasily in his seat. His earlier confidence had vanished, and now his papers seemed like useless scraps of paper. The two officers who had accused Marcus sat stiffly, their faces pale, avoiding the eyes of everyone around them. Judge Harlow slammed his gavel down. "Order, order," I said. The sharp crack echoed, but it no longer carried the same weight. Even the gavel sounded smaller now, weaker. General Anderson opened the folder again and pulled out documents, laying them on the table. "Here are sworn statements from Marcus's unit. They confirm where he was, what he did, and the honor he earned. These records are verified, stamped, and signed by the United States Army. This," he tapped the papers firmly, "is proof that every accusation you've allowed here is false." He turned to the audience, his voice steady but strong. And these lies were not just against Marcus. They were lies against truth, against justice, against every soldier who wears this uniform with pride. The courtroom erupted into murmurs again. Some clapped softly, though fear of the judge still lingered. Marcus's mother pressed her hands together tightly, tears streaming down her face. She whispered a prayer of thanks, her voice trembling. Marcus himself felt his chest rise and fall with deep emotion. He had stood in battlefields with bombs exploding around him, but this moment standing in front of his hometown, with his freedom hanging by a thread, this felt just as heavy. The general's words gave him strength he thought he had lost. Judge Harlow leaned forward, trying to reassert his power. His voice shook slightly as he spoke. "This is irrelevant to the case before us. Military documents do not erase the testimony of officers who lied." General Anderson interrupted, his voice sharp now. He turned, his eyes narrowing at the two policemen. "Stand up. The officers froze in their seats. The general's tone carried the weight of command, and though they were not his soldiers, instinctively they obeyed. Slowly they rose, avoiding his gaze. "Look at this man," the general said, pointing to Marcus. "He risked his life for strangers in countries you will never see. He carried wounded men across deserts. He stood guard in freezing nights, and he came home not asking for reward, but simply to see his mother again. And yet you dared to put handcuffs on him for a crime you knew he did not commit?" The officers shifted uncomfortably, their silence louder than any words. The crowd whispered louder now, anger stirring among them. The judge pounded his gavel again, his voice cracking. "That's enough. This is my courtroom. I decide what happens here." But General Anderson stepped closer to the bench, his presence towering. "No, Judge, today you will not decide. Today the truth will. And the truth is clear, this man is innocent." Marcus's mother stood suddenly, her voice breaking but full of courage. "My son is not guilty. You've tried to break him, but you will not win." Her words lit a fire in the crowd. People began nodding, whispering loudly, agreeing with her. Some even shouted, "Set him free!" Judge Harlow's face turned red with rage. He slammed the gavel again and again, but each strike sounded weaker, drowned out by the voices rising in the courtroom. For the first time, the power he had clung to for decades was slipping from his hands. General Anderson raised his hand, calming the room. Silence fell again, but this time the silence belonged to him, not the judge. He looked directly at Harlow, his voice calm but firm. "If you pass sentence on this man today, Judge, you will not only answer to me. You will answer to the army. You will answer to the people in this room. You will answer to every eye watching when this case reaches beyond this town." The weight of his words pressed down on the judge. Harlow looked around the courtroom. He saw not fear but defiance. He saw people who once lowered their heads now standing taller, their eyes no longer afraid. For the first time in his career, Judge Harlow felt cornered. He swallowed hard, his gavel trembling slightly in his hand. He muttered, This case will be reviewed further." But the general shook his head. "No, not further. Not later. Now." He placed the final piece of evidence on the table, a letter signed by higher command commending Marcus for his bravery in saving fellow soldiers during combat. The words were undeniable, written in official ink. "Stamped with the seal of the army." "Read it," the general said, his voice calm but commanding. The judge hesitated, his pride warring with the truth before him. His lips tightened, but under the piercing eyes of the general and the restless crowd, he unfolded the letter and began to read aloud. His voice cracked as he read Marcus's acts of courage, the night raids, the lives he saved, the wounds he endured. By the time he finished, the courtroom was silent, but not in fear. It was silent in awe. The crowd looked at Marcus not as a suspect but as a hero. His mother wept uncontrollably, her heart swelling with pride. Marcus stood tall, his eyes glistening but steady. He had never asked for recognition, but hearing his story spoken aloud in the very place where he had been treated as a criminal filled him with both pain and honor. Judge Harlow set the letter down, his hands trembling. His authority, once so untouchable, now felt like sand slipping through his fingers. He knew he could not fight against what had just been revealed. General Anderson stepped back, his gaze unwavering. "Now, Judge," he said firmly, "do what is right." The entire room leaned forward, waiting for the words that would decide Marcus's fate. The courtroom was silent after General Anderson spoke. Every eye was fixed on Judge Harlow, who sat frozen at his bench. His hand still clutched the gavel, but it no longer looked like a symbol of power. It looked small, fragile, almost meaningless in the face of truth that had just been laid bare. Marcus stood tall beside the general, his heart pounding. He felt as though the entire weight of his life had come down to this one moment. Years of discipline, sacrifice, and loyalty to his country had been mocked and dismissed in this courtroom. But now, for the first time, he felt hope rising like the sun after a long night. The judge cleared his throat, his voice rough. He looked out at the people filling the benches, their eyes no longer fearful but demanding. They had seen the truth. They had heard the proof. And they were waiting for him to admit what he had never admitted in his life, that he was wrong. Judge Harlow began, his words stumbling. He paused, his face red. For decades he had never been challenged. He had sentenced men with a single word. But today he faced not just a man, but a soldier, a community, and a general who carried the weight of the nation's honor on his shoulders. Finally, his voice broke the silence. "This court finds Sergeant Marcus Johnson not guilty." The words echoed through the room like thunder breaking after a long storm. For a moment, silence held. Then the courtroom erupted. People clapped, cheered, and even stood to their feet. Some wept openly, others shouted with joy. Marcus's mother cried out, rushing forward as far as she could, her hands shaking with relief. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she whispered, "Thank you, Lord, my boy is free." Marcus felt his throat tighten. He had dreamed of this moment since the day of his arrest. But hearing it, standing here with his dignity restored, was more powerful than he imagined. General Anderson placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "You see, son? The truth always stands. It may be buried for a time, but it can never be broken." Marcus swallowed hard, his voice low. "Thank you, sir. I don't know how to ever repay this." The general shook his head. "You already have. You repaid it when you carried your brothers off the battlefield, when you wore this uniform with pride, when you lived with honor, even when dishonor tried to chain you. You don't owe me. You owe yourself to keep standing tall." The crowd kept cheering and the sound grew louder, filling the room with something no one had felt there in years: hope. Judge Harlow sat stiffly, his face pale. He had lost more than a case. He had lost the shield of fear that had protected him for years. The people who once lowered their eyes before him now looked directly at him. Some glared. Others shook their heads in disgust. For the first time, his robe felt heavy, not with power but with shame. The general turned, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Let this be remembered. Justice is not a weapon for the powerful to use against the weak. Justice belongs to every man, no matter his color, no matter his place. And today it stood firm because one man refused to bow." He gestured toward Marcus, who stood silently, his eyes shining with pride and humility. As the courtroom emptied, people came to shake Marcus's hand. Old friends, neighbors, even strangers who had once doubted him now looked at him differently. "We're proud of you, son," one man said, his voice thick with emotion. Another woman pressed his hand gently, whispering, "You reminded us what courage looks like." Marcus's mother hugged him tightly, refusing to let go. "You've carried me all my life, Marcus. Now let me carry this joy for you." Outside the courthouse, the late afternoon sun shone brightly, as if the day itself celebrated the truth. Reporters had gathered, drawn by the unusual scene of a general standing in a small-town courtroom. Cameras flashed, microphones extended, and questions poured out. "General, why did you come here today?" one reporter asked. The general stood tall, his arm resting on Marcus's shoulder. "Because loyalty does not end on the battlefield. When one of my soldiers is attacked unjustly, it is my duty to stand by him. This uniform means nothing if it does not stand for justice." Another reporter turned to Marcus. "Sergeant Johnson, what do you want to say to the people after what you've gone through?" Marcus paused, his eyes sweeping across the crowd. His voice was calm, steady. "I want to say that no matter what happens, you must stand for the truth. Even if people mock you, even if they try to silence you, never bow your head when you've done nothing wrong. I stood as a soldier overseas, but today I learned I had to stand as a soldier here too." The people applauded again, their voices rising into the open air. That evening, Marcus returned home with his mother. The small house, once filled with fear and sorrow, now glowed with peace. Neighbors came by with food, hugs, and kind words. His mother's kitchen table, once heavy with worry, now overflowed with laughter and love. As night fell, Marcus sat quietly on the porch looking out at the stars. The general's words echoed in his mind. The truth always stands. He knew the battle in court had been won, but he also knew many others still faced injustice across the world. He promised himself that he would not stay silent again, not for himself and not for others. The next morning, newspapers across the state carried the story. "General defends soldier in courtroom, justice wins," one headline read. Another said, "Hero soldier freed after false charges." The story spread quickly, inspiring people beyond the small town. Letters of support arrived at Marcus's home, some from soldiers he had served with, others from strangers who simply wanted to thank him for his courage. Judge Harlow, on the other hand, faced scrutiny like never before. The state opened an investigation into his rulings, and the officers who had lied were suspended. For the first time in decades, the walls of corruption began to crack. But for Marcus, the greatest reward was not in headlines or public praise. It was in the quiet moments, his mother's smile, the handshake of an old friend, the knowledge that he had not bowed when it mattered most. A week later, before returning to duty, Marcus visited the general. They sat together in the general's office, the smell of coffee filling the air. "You taught me more than military training ever did," Marcus said quietly. "You taught me that courage doesn't end on the battlefield." The general nodded, his expression proud. "And you reminded me why I wear this uniform. It's not for medals. It's for men like you." They shook hands firmly, soldier to soldier, mentor to man. When Marcus returned to his unit, his fellow soldiers greeted him with cheers and laughter. They had heard the story, and they welcomed him back not just as a comrade, but as a symbol of resilience. That night, as he lay in his bunk, Marcus closed his eyes with a deep breath. The trial, the fear, the anger, they had all left scars. But those scars were marks of survival, reminders that he had faced injustice and stood firm. And he knew one thing for certain. No matter where life took him, no matter what battles lay ahead, he would never again allow anyone to steal his dignity, because Marcus Johnson was not just a soldier of the army. He was a soldier of truth. And truth, once it stands, can never be broken.